Recently, I set out to try to capture the best photograph of a lunar eclipse sequence in Haiti. I set out, I scouted, I looked for the best place to shoot, and what I ultimately found was an amazing experience. This is that story. One of my biggest goals in landscape photography has always been to come out and shoot a lunar eclipse and what they call blood moons or whatever they are. Now, there's one happening tomorrow night, so I wanted to come out here and scout. I think they're calling it like the wolf blood moon or something. It's a lunar eclipse. Like, why are we giving all these weird names to things that make no sense? But to photograph a lunar eclipse, there's a lot that needs to go right. There's a lot can happen that can make the photograph go wrong, and there's a lot of planning that goes into it that you need to get out beforehand. So I'm out here in Haiti actually scouting things out. How do I want my photo to be set up? What time do I need to come out and actually shoot this? So that's kind of what I'm doing today. Now, one of the biggest things is the planning aspect of shooting a lunar eclipse, and what you use when you do that is PhotoPills. And I've done a video on PhotoPills in the past that you can watch if you click the card that's coming up on your screen right now. But I wanted to take you through the entire process. What am I doing to plan this out? What can you do to do the same thing so that you can take the same kind of lunar eclipse photographs? But before we go any further, I just want to tell you, this is not going to be an all-in camera shot. This has a lot of editing that takes place. We're merging multiple images. We're doing different things in the image blending that's going to require multiple lenses. So this is kind of like a pretty advanced topic, and hopefully the photograph comes out. But it's something that I've never tried before. And before you're I can see the comments right now coming in. Before you're hey, this is not an actual photograph, you created this, blah, blah, blah. I have no problem with photo creation. Photo creation is actually something that's pretty cool if you actually look through it and appreciate what they did with their lens selection or their blending and post-processing, whatever they're using. And before you get high and mighty on completely bashing photo blending or photo creation, as long as you say this was not an all-in-camera shot, this was a photo creation or whatever you want to call it, I have no problem with that. Some of the best landscape photographers like Sean Bagshaw have done this. That's where I actually got the inspiration to get this shot. I'm gonna link that photo below in the video description so you guys can go and check it out if you're interested in what I'm trying to do here. But first, let's get into the planning part. So what I'm doing is using PhotoPills. So what you have to do when you get PhotoPills, and again, that's linked below in the video description for you guys to check out. You open PhotoPills and immediately the screen comes up. What you want to do is start planning this out. Can you even see the eclipse where you are in the world? So I'm going to go to Planner, and once that is pulled up, all you have to do to find each eclipse that's happening is you double tap on your location. Then you hit the map layers icon that's right next to the plus icon on your screen, and the map settings come up. You want to go all the way to the bottom to eclipse. Now you click on eclipse and you can select each type of eclipse, whether that's lunar or solar. And I'm going to click on 1/20/19 because that's the eclipse that's going to be happening. And then I'm going to toggle this eye icon on so I can see where the eclipse is going to be visible at any spot in the world. And I'm going to hit done, and that's going to bring up this map here. So the red pin is actually where I am in Haiti. And as you see, if I zoom in some, you can see that it says eclipse visible. So I'm in between this graph and this dip of blue lines. That's going to mean that the eclipse is visible in my area, and it's actually a huge swath of land here. All of North America, South America, and even parts of Africa are going to be able to see this. So that's pretty cool. If you're in Hawaii, you might be able to see a little bit of it too. So that's basically how you plan this out. Where is it going to be? What I like to do when I do that, I'm still in PhotoPills here, is go to the exact time of peak eclipse. Now, what's that going to be is about 12 o'clock. So I'm on 12 o'clock right now. As you can see on the bottom bar of this, I have the sun and the moon in opposite positions. So that's going to be when I have the peak eclipse. And then I'm going to select night augmented reality. Now this is where I turn my phone, and I'm just gonna like find where the moon actually is. The gray line on the screen is the path of the moon. So what I'm doing is trying to see exactly where the moon's rising and where the path is going to be at midnight. So the moon's been rising directly behind here, and all I'm gonna do is follow this gray line up and see exactly where it is. So about midnight, it's going to be directly above my head where the peak lunar eclipse is going to be happening. Now, I'm trying to find the best composition to do that. It's going to be a little bit difficult because with eclipse, a full eclipse, it's happening directly over my head. How do you really frame up a composition to have the moon in the shot altogether? Well, that leads me to what gear do I have in my bag to shoot this? All right, so to shoot this, I have multiple cameras that I'm gonna be using. Number one, I'm getting a foreground composition with a wide angle lens. I'm using a Sony a6000 and a Rokinon 12mm f2 ultra wide angle lens to get that shot. We're gonna go over that in just a second. And then I'm also gonna have another camera set up. So this is a multiple camera, multiple lens operation that we're dealing with. High level stuff that I'm sure I can possibly find a way to mess up. So the other lens that I'm gonna be using is a Sony 70-200 f4 that I'm actually going to be shooting each phase of the lunar eclipse going through, where it starts where you have like a full moon and then going from like opaque red all the way to red and then following it across the sky to back to where it's white again. So I'm gonna be using this lens for that. So I'm gonna be shooting foregrounds and close-ups of the lunar eclipse at the exact same time. Gonna be dancing from camera to camera. Should be very comical for anyone watching. But what is the composition actually going to look like? Well, let's get right into that. All right, here's the composition that I've set up behind me to get with the ultra wide angle lens. I wanted it to be like really wide so you could see a lot of the sky. So I wanted to use the ultra wide lens to really bring all that in. It's a 12mm that's gonna be able to do that. And I also wanted to get like kind of an interesting foreground. That's kind of hard to do here because you have like a lot of trash that's laying around. You know, it's not the most beautiful ground you could have, but there are a lot of cool trees that you can include into the foreground, and I wanted to have like one on one side, try to get one on the other side, kind of framing this in, because what the wide angle lens is going to do is really warp those and have them kind of pointing up towards the sky, towards that lunar eclipse when we get it. And I wanted them to like pointing all attention to the lunar eclipse. And then there are some really cool ferns that you can see behind me that I wanted to get into the bottom of the foreground and really try to light those up. I'm gonna have to take kind of a long exposure. It's a little bit difficult to do long exposure foregrounds at night, just because if there's any wind, if there's any shake, especially with the ferns and the leaves on the trees like they're shaking right now with just a tiny bit of breeze going on in the air, you know, they're gonna shake and it's gonna be like blurred motion going on in the foreground shot. So I kind of have to be patient on waiting until that's actually going to be a good shot while managing where the lunar eclipse is going on in the sky and what phase it's in. I think what I'm gonna do is set a timer on my phone of 15 minutes and shoot the lunar eclipse at 15-minute intervals, so to be sure that I don't miss any phase that's going on, getting distracted with the other camera or anything like that. So that's kind of the plan going forward. There's a lot that like actually can go wrong when I'm setting up this shot, and like as I'm looking around right now and as I've been tracking the weather the past few days, there's actually a whole lot that can go wrong. All right, so one of the things that I'm really concerned about going wrong is that the weather doesn't cooperate. Now, if I'm shooting the night sky, obviously I want the weather to be clear. I want a clear sky because any cloud cover is really gonna occlude that lunar eclipse. So I wanna be sure the night sky is clear. Now, for the past few nights, and if you want to shoot a photo like this, you really have to track what's going on around you. And for the past 4 nights, it's rained at about 10:30 p.m. That's not good for what we're doing with this lunar eclipse, because 10:30 is probably going to be one of the main phases of the eclipse, probably like a quarter of the way eclipse. So I want to be sure that the night sky is pretty clear for that phase. And every day, one of the things I wanted to do is get a time lapse or a basic shot of the moonrise that's going to be happening right here. Now, for the past few days, again, we've had tons of clouds building over this mountain range that would occlude that moonrise. I thought that would be a cool way to like fade in a time lapse into this, or just get a single shot of the moon rising, like a big full moon, super moon that's happening. Another thing that I'm a little bit worried about happening is this. For the past few nights, there's been a cow right where I want the foreground to be. Will this cow ruin my shot? I have no idea, but I'm really hoping that this cow is not present for my nighttime shoot of the lunar eclipse, because he's been kind of aggressive. Now, last thing I need to be aware of is ambient light. Now, luckily for me, here's the composition again. Port-au-Prince, the main city and where most of the power is in Haiti, is the opposite direction, which is good for me getting a foreground, because I'm not going to have a whole lot of ambient light that I'm going to have to deal with. The problem with the light here is that I have to get pretty low. Not only is that going to work for my foreground, but also there's a house here, and I want to be sure that the motion sensor lights that come on and off don't come on and off, because that can ruin my shot, have some weird lighting in the frame that I don't really want. So I want to be sure that I time my foreground shot or any of my other shots that are going to be light sensitive to a point where they aren't going off. So sensitive that like when the wind blows a tree, they come on. So that could be an issue that I really have to think about. But that is pretty much it. I think I've scouted the whole location. I'm ready for tomorrow night. I'm gonna be loaded up on coffee for sure. Probably bring some in my Yeti out with me while I shoot and stay up all night. Cow, are you gonna ruin my shot? Just say no. About 9 o'clock right now. The eclipse is supposed to start around 9:30 here near Port-au-Prince, and we got pretty lucky today because we had some pretty heavy cloud cover all day, and then it started breaking up this afternoon. So coming out here and setting up the initial shots, which you have to remember is the initial like speed shots you have to get, because since we're dealing with a foreground that doesn't really matter in any set time, we're worried about the lunar eclipse in terms of time and the different stages of the eclipse. I can get the foreground whenever I want, so what I'm really focused on right now is getting the stages of the eclipse. So what I'm going to do is set my lens up, my 70-200 f4 lens, and shoot the first stage of the eclipse right now, and then I'll probably set my timer on my phone for about 30 minutes, and every 30 minutes I'll shoot one of those. In between those, I'll turn this way and start getting the foreground shots that I need for this specific merge and this end result that I want to get. So we're going to go ahead and start shooting for the first stage of the lunar eclipse right now. So for these first initial shots of the stages of the moon, you have to remember that with a lunar eclipse, especially a full moon eclipse that we're dealing with tonight, the moon is going to be really bright. So unlike a Milky Way shot where you have to set your camera up to 30 seconds, f2, ISO 800 to 1600, what we're dealing with is a brighter moon. So I'm actually shooting at 1/100th of a second, f8, ISO 100, because I want to get just the moon in these shots. Really good detail on the moon and not overblowing any of the highlights that are coming off of that. And I want a lot of the detail and texture on the surface of the moon. So we're just shooting shots of that right now. And then, like I said, we'll turn around and get the foreground later. So right now I'm shooting the foreground shot. I just finished shooting the second moon shot that we got that happened at 9:38. So now I'm waiting for 10:08 on the next moon phase shot. I'm literally like surrounded by dogs right now. The cow isn't here, which is awesome, but now I have dogs constantly circling me and growling at each other, which is fun. The challenge here on the foreground shot isn't clouds or anything like that. The challenge is motion. So since I have a lot of trees and like ferns and foliage, any wind that happens is going to cause any blurring in the actual shot. So I'm trying to reduce that, waiting for a moment that doesn't have any wind, which I think I've got right now. And then I'm teetering back and forth between two different settings. So my first shot, what I got for the foreground, was actually f4 ISO 800 and then a 2-second exposure, and did really well because there wasn't very much wind, and a 2-second exposure really isn't that long, especially for night photography or something related to that, especially right now what we're dealing with the lunar eclipse and how much the moon is actually lighting up this environment and foreground that we're actually shooting. But I wanted to try to reduce that ISO to reduce the amount of graininess in the photo, so I went to ISO 400, an 8-second exposure, still at f4, and we'll see how that turns out. I don't know if 8 seconds was too long for any like wind to come through and shake the leaves or anything like that, but you know, we'll review the two shots and see what we get. But the foreground shot looks pretty good. It's pretty much what I wanted to get for a foreground. So I like the way the trees are really pointing towards the sky and like directing you right at the moon phases that were coming in. There's some clouds on the opposite side that the wind is starting to change direction that I'm watching. I'm a little bit nervous about for the overall eclipse, but hopefully it'll work out. The rest of the sky is clear, so I'm not too worried about that. I may get dengue fever though, as I'm getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. So just another compelling twist in the plot for this eclipse shot. So just wrapped up the fourth phase of the moon shot. Having a little bit of difficulty right now with overhead conditions. We had a bunch of clouds roll through that were kind of patchy. So I'm really glad I got the foreground shot already, because that's clearly ruined. I mean, we have clouds passing by really fast right behind us. So there's no clear sky. If I had done a shot with the clouds in it, then I probably would have had to wait for the moon to pass behind some clouds, or the clouds to pass in front of the moon, and kind of gotten a shot that would make it a little bit more realistic of having the moon behind clouds and so forth. And it would have been a struggle to get the lighting right on that because of the amount of light reflected from behind the moon. We're at about a third of the way through the eclipse right now. It's really cool, probably one of the coolest things that I've seen. This has been on my bucket list for a long time to be able to shoot this, but about a third of the way shot right now. I adjusted my settings a little bit because the moon is still so bright and I'm able to shoot it. My tripod was giving me fits since the moon is literally like straight vertical. So just to make it a little bit easier, I switched my settings up to 1/320th of a second and f8 ISO 400, and I'm able to actually handhold this and shoot the eclipse as it's happening, which has proven to be way easier when it gets a little bit darker. Like when you start getting that blood moon effect and the full eclipse, I may have to go back to the tripod to get a little bit more stability. There's also some more clouds coming this way, so I am just praying that when it does hit full eclipse that those will not be here yet. So could ruin the shot. The biggest lesson I've learned as a landscape photographer is that you can plan all you want, but when it comes down to it, the conditions may not be right and your planning may have been just for naught. So it's all like, this is what I love about landscape photography: coming out, taking the risk, knowing the risk before you get out, and having everything prepared in case everything goes right. I just have my fingers crossed that the rest of the tonight goes the way I want it to. So we just hit peak on the eclipse. It went total red. Just a couple tips while we wrap up the shoot. I'm not going to take you through the whole like unwinding of the eclipse where it goes back to the full moon, but just a couple observances that you guys need to know the next time you want to go out in the field and do the same thing. Number one, it takes way longer than you think it will. I've been out here now for 3 hours, got another 2.5 to go now that we're at the midpoint. So pretty excited to watch the rest of this unfold and then get back inside and go to bed because my coffee is totally worn off by now. But just like in your settings, you're constantly going to have to adjust those because the light changes so drastically. When we came out here, you could barely see any stars, and now I can even see the tail end of the Milky Way, and it's the middle of winter, which like is pretty hard to do unless you're in a really dark area. So as the moon continues to become a full eclipse and gets really dark and red, you get a lot more stars coming out because it gets so dark. So your settings are gonna have to adjust for that too. I started at 1/320th of a second. I went all the way down to 1/30th of a second, and then even bumped my ISO up to 800 and even 1250, and then even opened my aperture a lot more. I went all the way to f4, as wide as my aperture could go on my lens, and I was still a little too dark, but I'm going to be able to adjust that in post-processing too. So always be mindful of your settings and your surroundings and just what's going on with the weather. Get your foreground shots when you have time and when the conditions are right. Obviously we had clouds move in and now it's pretty windy, so I wouldn't be able to get those shots now anyways. So while it was dead still and I had enough light to do what I needed to do with the foreground and there were no clouds in the sky, go ahead and get that while you're waiting on the eclipse to change as well. So really just trying to figure out what to do for the next 2.5 hours while I wait for my alarm to go off every 30 minutes. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this. Here's the final image.